What if I told you that a single missile launched in the Middle East just changed the price of your morning coffee? That the echo of war between Iran and Israel is now being felt in your wallet, your neighborhood, your future? This isn't just another news story, it's a global wake-up call. Behind rising fuel prices and breaking headlines lies a deeper truth about how fragile our world really is. In the next few minutes, you're not just going to hear about oil or war. You're going to witness how a distant conflict has shaken the world economy, ignited public unrest, and tested the nerves of nations. This is more than politics. It's about people. It's about you. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll not only understand what's happening, but you'll feel why it matters and why now is the time to pay attention like never before. The recent escalation of the Iran-Iraq conflict marks a significant turning point in Middle Eastern geopolitics, igniting fears across the globe. For years, tensions between the two nations have simmered beneath the surface, manifesting through proxy wars, cyber operations, and veiled threats. However, the current confrontation is different. It is direct, open, and dangerously aggressive. The exchange of missile and drone strikes between Iran and Israel represents a departure from the shadow warfare that has long characterized their rivalry. This time, the world witnessed open military aggression, triggering immediate international concern. This escalation comes amid an already fragile global environment marked by war fatigue, economic instability, and the lingering aftershocks of previous conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. The attack not only destabilizes an already volatile region, but also sets the stage for a broader and more devastating conflict. Iran's military response was framed as a retaliation for previous provocations, while Israel's counteroffensive was swift and heavy-handed, escalating the spiral of violence. The strikes were not symbolic. They were intended to inflict damage and demonstrate. The intensity of the attacks signaled that neither side was interested in de-escalation at this stage. It sent shockwaves through the international community, which immediately began bracing for the possibility of a prolonged regional war. Markets responded within hours. Intelligence agencies across the globe raised alerts, and militaries in neighboring countries went on high readiness. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Turkey began diplomatic communications aimed at preventing a spillover. Meanwhile, superpowers like the United States and Russia issued carefully worded statements, balancing condemnation with calls for restraint. However, behind diplomatic caution lay a deeper concern. This conflict could disrupt vital trade routes, spark sectarian violence, and draw in multiple nations into a dangerous quagmire. The psychological effect of the strikes has also been profound. For citizens across the region, the fear of more violence became immediate and personal. Air raid sirens, emergency shelters, and fuel shortages have become part of daily life. Even beyond the region, the strikes created anxiety among civilians and investors as global security appeared more fragile than ever. The direct confrontation between Iran and Israel represents not just a regional flashpoint, but a dangerous moment in modern international affairs, capable of unleashing widespread economic, political, and human consequences. The Iran-Israel conflict has raised immediate alarm over the security of critical oil infrastructure and shipping routes in the Middle East, particularly the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, situated between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, is the most strategically important choke point for global oil transportation. Nearly 20% of the world's petroleum passes through it daily, making it a lifeline for both producing and consuming nations. Any threat to its accessibility causes ripple effects across global energy markets. In the wake of the strikes, fears emerged that Iran, either directly or through allied proxies, could disrupt traffic through the strait as a form of retaliation or leverage. Such a move wouldn't only escalate military tensions, but would immediately constrict the supply of oil to global markets. Energy infrastructure on land is also at risk. Both Iran and Israel are surrounded by oil-rich nations and pipelines critical to regional supply. The potential for targeted strikes, sabotage, or accidental damage to refineries, export terminals, or pipelines has skyrocketed. Iran has previously threatened to target oil infrastructure in the Gulf if attacked, and with tensions now at a boiling point, those threats feel more real than ever. Likewise, oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are worried that their facilities could be caught in the crossfire, either intentionally or as collateral damage. Shipping companies have begun rerouting tankers to avoid risk zones, causing logistical delays and adding to transportation costs. Insurance premiums for vessels crossing the region have surged, reflecting the elevated threat level. Some carriers are even pausing operations temporarily, unwilling to gamble with lives or cargo. All of this contributes to supply chain instability. That doesn't just impact oil, but also the broader network of goods transported through these waters. The specter of an attack on maritime or onshore infrastructure doesn't just affect those directly involved in the conflict. Nations dependent on oil imports, particularly in Asia and Europe, have expressed deep concern. They rely heavily on energy that transits through these vulnerable points, and any prolonged disruption could choke economic activity, drive inflation, and trigger political instability. The vulnerability of such a vital region underscores just how interconnected and fragile the modern energy web truly is when exposed to geopolitical conflict. The immediate consequence of the Iran-Israel strikes was a dramatic and rapid surge in global crude oil prices, sending shockwaves through financial markets and national economies. Within hours of the initial conflict, oil futures spiked by more than 20%, reflecting widespread panic and uncertainty about the stability of global supply. The surge was not just a result of actual physical damage or blockage of supply routes, but rather the anticipation of what could follow. Markets are driven as much by perception as by reality, and the fear that the conflict could escalate into a wider regional war triggered massive speculative buying, hoarding, and risk hedging among traders. Investors scrambled to adjust their positions, while oil importing nations began reassessing their reserves and energy security strategies. The sudden price spike meant immediate implications for global inflation, as oil remains a cornerstone commodity that affects the costs of nearly everything: transportation, manufacturing, logistics, and even agriculture. Central banks and policy institutions were forced to monitor the situation closely, knowing that sustained high oil prices could derail economic recoveries, particularly in the post-pandemic world, still grappling with fragile supply chains and inflationary pressures. Countries highly dependent on oil imports, such as India, Japan, and several European nations, felt the pressure almost instantly. Their energy bills rose, putting strain on national budgets, trade deficits, and foreign exchange reserves. Airlines raised fuel surcharges, logistics companies adjusted freight costs, and gas stations in several regions began updating prices daily. The poor and working classes in many nations, who already spend a large portion of their income on fuel and food, were hit hardest as price increases quickly reached retail markets. Meanwhile, oil-exporting nations, especially those in OPEC, observed the developments with caution. While a price spike benefits their short-term revenues, the risk of global recession due to expensive energy is a long-term threat, even to producers. Additionally, the price volatility caused by geopolitical tension is not sustainable and makes planning and investment difficult, even for those benefiting from the rise. The market's reaction was a reflection of both immediate shock and long-term uncertainty. It exposed the vulnerability of a global economy that is still deeply dependent on oil, and how a single geopolitical flashpoint can create financial tremors felt in every corner of the world within hours. The surge in oil prices triggered by the Iran-Israel conflict has had immediate and far-reaching ripple effects across the global economy, impacting nearly every sector and household, especially in vulnerable nations. As oil prices climbed rapidly, the cost of energy-dependent goods and services began to rise in tandem. Transportation costs surged, affecting shipping companies, airlines, and even public transit systems. This translated into higher logistics expenses for businesses, which in turn passed those costs on to consumers. In many parts of the world, fuel stations raised prices daily, making it harder for average citizens to afford commutes, travel, or even run small businesses. The inflationary pressure hit developing countries the hardest. Many of these nations are heavily reliant on imported oil and lack strategic reserves or subsidies to shield their population. Governments in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of Latin America were faced with a difficult balancing act. Either absorb the financial blow to protect their citizens or allow market prices to rise and face public backlash. In some places, protests erupted as frustration over rising costs compounded existing economic hardships. Fuel shortages, hoarding, and black market trading began to reappear in several economies already under strain. In wealthier nations, the rise in oil prices accelerated inflation trends that central banks had been struggling to control. Consumers noticed the difference not only at the pump, but in grocery stores, utility bills, and service industries. As diesel prices climbed, food transportation costs increased, raising the price of essential staples. Manufacturing sectors, particularly those relying on petrochemicals or energy-intensive production processes, began experiencing supply chain delays and price hikes. These disruptions affected both domestic production and exports, leading to reduced economic activity and consumer spending. Small businesses, already weakened by previous economic shocks, found themselves in a tight corner as operating costs soared and profit margins shrank. Many were forced to lay off workers or shut down operations. The employment market, particularly in service-based and labor-dependent economies, began to show signs of stress. Governments were pressured to implement emergency measures such as subsidies, tax relief, or public aid programs to calm growing unrest and shield the most affected communities. The oil price surge, while rooted in geopolitical conflict, exposed the fragility of a world still overly dependent on fossil fuels, showing how interconnected markets can transfer the shock of distant wars directly into the homes and pockets of millions of ordinary people. As the conflict between Iran and Israel escalated, global leaders responded with urgent calls for calm, while simultaneously preparing for a broader and potentially long-term energy and security crisis. The initial reaction from major world powers, including the United States, European Union, China, and Russia, was a series of diplomatic appeals aimed at preventing further escalation. Statements emphasized the need for restraint, dialogue, and the avoidance of actions that could further destabilize the already fragile region. Behind these public appeals, however, was a flurry of private strategy meetings, intelligence assessments, and emergency planning sessions focused on managing the fallout if the conflict deepened. Governments began activating emergency energy protocols to safeguard national interests. The United States signaled a potential release from its strategic petroleum reserve to stabilize domestic fuel prices and reassure markets. European nations, particularly those heavily reliant on oil imports from the Gulf, initiated discussions on diversifying their energy sources, accelerating investment in renewables, and strengthening ties with alternative oil suppliers. China, deeply dependent on Middle Eastern oil for its industrial and transport sectors, issued a rare dual warning, condemning violence while quietly securing more long-term energy contracts with Russia and African producers as a buffer against possible disruptions. Global financial institutions and central banks also went into alert mode. Many began recalibrating economic forecasts and stress testing their inflation control strategies under various oil price scenarios. Countries in vulnerable regions convened emergency economic task forces, fearing that prolonged high energy prices could push their economies into recession or provoke public unrest. The International Energy Agency and OPEC members held urgent consultations trying to assess the likely trajectory of supply and demand in the event of prolonged conflict. Meanwhile, the military and security apparatus in many countries quietly prepared for contingency operations. Allied forces in the Persian Gulf region heightened surveillance and maritime patrols to secure oil transport routes. NATO partners reviewed defense postures, while Israel and Iran bolstered air defense systems and mobilized reserve forces. In neighboring Arab states, borders were put on high alert and oil infrastructure security was intensified. Though world leaders continued to speak of peace and de-escalation in public, their actions reflected a deep awareness that the situation could spiral. The duality of their response, pleas for calm, coupled with preparations for crisis, revealed both the seriousness of the threat and the precarious balance of power in a region whose instability has global consequences. The Iran-Israel strikes triggered not only economic and geopolitical repercussions, but also ignited widespread public anxiety and the early signs of political unrest in various regions. Across many countries, particularly those with economies vulnerable to energy price shocks, citizens responded with fear, anger, and uncertainty. In cities from Cairo to Karachi, long lines began forming at gas stations amid rumors of fuel shortages. Panic buying surged, with people stockpiling essential goods in anticipation of further disruptions. The psychological effect of waking up to news of missile exchanges between two powerful and historically antagonistic states shook public confidence in global stability. Social media platforms became flooded with footage of burning fuel depots, sirens wailing in the night, and oil prices flashing red across trading screens. In many countries, especially where the cost of living was already high, this only deepened the frustration among working-class families who saw their purchasing power evaporate almost overnight. As inflation climbed and wages stagnated, people took to the streets demanding action from their governments. Protests erupted in multiple capitals, some peaceful, others turning violent, as citizens vented their outrage not only at the rising cost of fuel and food, but also at their leaders' perceived inability to shield them from international crises. In democratic societies, the crisis quickly became a political battleground. Opposition parties seized on the situation to criticize ruling governments, accusing them of weak foreign policy, poor energy planning, and failure to maintain strategic reserves. In authoritarian regimes, the fear of civil disobedience prompted preemptive crackdowns, curfews, and tighter media control to suppress dissent. Across the political spectrum, leaders were forced to make urgent speeches and policy announcements to calm their populations. But in many cases, the promises rang hollow against the backdrop of global instability. Mistrust in institutions deepened, especially among youth, who viewed the crisis as yet another example of how global systems prioritize power over people. Students, activists, and civil society groups called for more than temporary subsidies or price caps. They demanded long-term reforms in energy policy, diplomacy, and accountability. In countries already dealing with internal strife or economic fragility, the external shock served as a catalyst for larger movements, as people began to connect their personal hardships with global decision-making and geopolitical arrogance. The sense of living in an interconnected but unprotected world became a dominant theme in conversations across cafes, classrooms, and communities, heightening the pressure on governments to do more than just manage prices. They were now being called to lead. In a world already teetering on the edge of uncertainty, the Iran-Israeli strikes did more than ignite conflict. They exposed the fragility of global systems we take for granted. Oil prices didn't just rise, they sent shockwaves through economies, households, and hearts. From trade routes threatened to inflation crushing the common man. From leaders scrambling behind closed doors to citizens rising in the streets, this crisis has become a mirror reflecting the world's deep interdependence and unresolved tensions. It is no longer just a regional conflict. It is a global reckoning, a test of leadership, of resilience, and of unity in the face of division. Let this not be just another headline in the endless cycle of crisis. Let this be a call to rethink what stability means, to value peace as strategy, not weakness, and to recognize that in today's world, one strike can shake us all. The future will be defined not by what triggered the panic, but by how the world chooses to respond to it. Thank you for watching till the end. Stay aware, stay strong, and keep rising above fear. Wishing you wisdom, courage, and peace in uncertain times. Good luck, and see you in the next message that matters.